Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. What is the state of the economy today? How much damage might the virus and the lockdown do to the economy? And what are the steps that are needed to remedy and rectify the situation? Those are three key issues I should raise today with the co-chairman of Forbes, Marshall, and a former president of the Confederation of Indian Industry, Naushad Forbes. Mr. Forbes, let's start with the state of the economy. And I'll put that to you in two questions, one by one. There is a view that in June green shoots were emerging because of things like improvement in electricity generation, consumption of petroleum products, increases in revenue earning by traffic on the railways, as well as a certain measure of rebound in FMCG sales, tractor sales, two-wheeler sales. Do you agree with this view that this constitutes green shoots, or is it an overinterpretation?
So I think we should start with what happened in April and May, and then place June in that context. In April, everything came to, as you know, a complete halt as a result of the very stringent lockdown. Most of manufacturing stopped. Much of logistics stopped as well. Neither of those, in my view, were actually the right thing to do at the time, but that's what happened. In May, we saw some reopening and some recovery. And in June, we saw, indeed, as you mentioned, a much more substantive recovery. What I'm hearing from people in the FMCG sector particularly is that in June, rural and semi-urban demand was essentially back to last year's level. So it wasn't just green shoots, it was a reasonably full-fledged recovery to last year's level. In urban areas, though, demand was still quite depressed. And I think companies talked about demand being maybe 40, 50% of where they would typically have been last year. So I think in June, we saw a very substantive recovery in all those areas which were less affected by the virus and which were less subject to lockdowns. In the urban areas, especially the larger metros that were still subject to lockdowns in June, we saw a much more modest recovery. July has been somewhat different, and we can come to that, I'm sure, in a minute.
Well, I was going to bring you to July immediately because at least two major pink papers, both the Economic Times and the Business Standard, have said that the recovery or the growth that we witnessed in June has tapered off. One paper says the momentum has been lost in July. And this view is also endorsed by the Center for Monitoring the Indian Industry. But I'd be keen to know what you think has happened in July. Has the growth of June tapered off?
So what we've seen in July is that in certain areas which were not so affected by the virus in June, such as Bangalore and Karnataka, you've seen constraints in July as the virus has spread in Karnataka, as it has spread in Andhra Pradesh, as it has, at least if not spread, been recognized as having spread in Telangana. As this has happened, we've seen in the south of the country, we've seen some lockdowns being imposed, some rational, some irrational. And as a result, we've seen some tapering off of some economic activity in those parts of the country which in June were actually better. But other parts of the country, I would argue that July has actually been better than June. So where does it all come out finally in total? I don't know. My own guess is that we will actually show in July probably about the same economic activity overall as we saw in June. That's my guess. But we'll see once the month ends and once the GST returns and so on come in. I'm really keen to look at the numbers, at what we see, as the GST numbers, because that's the most immediate, concrete, real data that we get for the economy. And we saw that recover we saw a huge drop in April. We saw that recover very substantially to about 91% of last year's level in June. I want to see what the number is in July because I think that's what will actually say what's happened.
We'll know that in a couple of days' time, hopefully. But let me first put to you the view of the government. Speaking to FICCI on the 24th, Tarun Bajaj, the Economic Affairs Secretary, said, June and July have been more promising than we initially thought. I am expecting a V-shaped recovery. But just 3 days later, in an interview to the Business Standard, Tarun Bajaj said, the V-shaped recovery will come over a year. This year is a very difficult one. Now, to me, that sounds like two substantially different assessments delivered 3 days apart. On the first occasion, he talks of a V-shaped recovery. On 3 days later, the V-shape seems to be becoming a U-shape.
So the disadvantage of talking about the shape of a recovery in the absence of an x-axis is that you do not know how wide the two arms of your V are, or you are. If you take the great sweep of Indian history, I'm sure that even if it takes us 2 years to recover, it will show as a V-shaped recovery. So if you take Indian history over 2,000 years and growth over 2,000 years, it will show as a V-shaped recovery. It'll show a little blip, right? But if you say that, listen, V-shaped means that in 3 months' time we should be back to last year's level, I don't think we're going to have a V-shaped recovery. I think it's going to be a U-shaped recovery. I think it's going to be the second half of the year at a minimum, and probably the fourth quarter of the year before we are getting to last year's level of economic activity. And remember that if we get to last year's level of economic activity in the fourth quarter, that means that we're going to show a significant minus in overall GDP growth for this current year. The most optimistic estimates are.
Can I stop you there? I'll come to GDP growth in a moment's time, but let me first put two other things to you so that we can get a better picture of where the economy stands today. One sector of the economy that's shown remarkable resilience is agriculture. We've had a bumper Rabi harvest, and it seems from all accounts that the area under cultivation for Kharif is perhaps as much as 18.5% more than last year. In fact, the finance minister has gone on record to say, and I'm quoting her, we can clearly see agriculture driving the revival. My only concern is that agriculture is just about 15% of the GDP. So how much driving can agriculture do?
So agriculture is 15% of GDP, but the rural economy in India is 70% of the population. And I think we need to keep both those data points in mind. So the 15% of GDP has indeed been very resilient, will continue to be. It's been unaffected through this entire lockdown. In fact, in some respects, it's actually been helped by the lockdown as people have migrated back to rural areas, and you've had more labor suddenly available in rural areas to help with the harvest and with sowing. So in that sense, if you like, the lockdowns have probably spurred GDP activity in GDP growth in agriculture slightly. Yeah. Now, having said that, I think the government has also done something very useful in its economic recovery package, which will have a medium-term effect on agriculture if properly implemented. And these are the agricultural reforms that have been announced that make us more of a single market and that remove state scope for interference in markets in pricing for essential commodities. We have to see how that actually rolls out and is implemented on the ground. But if it's effectively implemented, it could be in the medium term very valuable and powerful for agricultural growth next year and the year after and to come.
Now, one more factor about the present situation before I turn and ask you what the impact of the virus and the lockdown will be on GDP growth for the year as a whole. And that factor is the continuing, if not escalating, COVID crisis we're living with. We've already crossed 1.5 million infections. We're growing virtually at 50,000 a day. And we have epidemiological forecasts made by some of the internationally most renowned epidemiologists would say that by the end of August, we could have a total of 100 million infections, counting both those detected as well as those undetected. Clearly, this is a situation that is getting worse and worse as the economy is trying to revive at the same time. The unlockdown is now simultaneously with an escalation in the virus. What impact will that have on the economy as we try and revive?
It's the big uncertainty in our future. And I am not seeing adequate engagement with how we as a country will deal with the question. It's you're absolutely right, Karan. It's the question, and it's the uncertainty that we should be working jointly some scenarios out for. I fear that there's a deeper issue that we must address, which is there seems to be, there seems to be an approach from the government that everything has been handled really well. I don't care about the past. I don't think there's much purpose served by talking about what could we have done better with 2020 hindsight. But I do think there is a lot of merit in being very realistic and authentic about where we currently stand. And where we currently stand, as you mentioned, is a worsening health crisis. Um, with the infection rate growing at 50,000 per day, but there's every chance that that 50,000 could become 60,000 in a few days, that could become 70,000, which would mean we would then be adding more cases per day than any other country in the world. So we're talking about a potentially huge health crisis, and I do not see that being adequately talked about and recognized in our public discourse. If we recognized it effectively, we would be responding in different ways to what needed to be done. In a way, we took really drastic action to try and control the spread of the epidemic when we had very few cases, when we had less than 1,000 cases in the country. Today, when we have a rampantly spreading epidemic, we are instead opening up. What signal does this send? If we say that, okay, now in the next phase of opening up, here's what we will now permit, the message that we're sending out is that things are getting back to normal. I agree with the need to restore more and more economic activity, but I believe it's very important for that restoration of economic activity to be accompanied by very direct and strong messaging on the health crisis that we face and the importance of doing things to mitigate the spread of the infection. And I think keeping on coming back to, look, this is why social distancing matters. This is why wearing a mask matters. And wearing a mask and not wearing a chin strap, as we see thousands of our fellow citizens doing on the street, right? And this is why washing hands matters. And I think we should be seeing a drip. I really, let me, if I could just finish. I mean, I really think there should be day-to-day messaging reinforcing these three principles. It needs to be done by our leading politicians at the central level, at the state level, at the city level. There needs to be science that's being talked about, the science underlying hand washing, the science underlying social distancing, showing how the infection spreads and how we can actually control it by these three principles. I'm not saying that we don't talk about it, we don't talk about it enough. It should be in our face every day.
I understand the point you're making, and it arises from the fundamental contradiction that you very correctly pointed out, that the health crisis is steadily getting worse, if not exponentially getting worse, precisely as we are steadily and increasingly opening up. But are you saying that we need better messaging, more forceful messaging, repeatedly done, or are you also suggesting, although you haven't said it, we need to reconsider the opening up? Is the speed of opening up to be reconsidered as well, or are you happy with the opening up and are you just saying, let's have more messaging, more effectively done, more repeatedly done?
So without question, we need, I think, much more effective, powerful messaging backed up by science. I think keeping on backing it up with data and showing how small things that we do on a day-to-day basis in the way we live can make a difference to health outcomes for the country. But on the opening up, I think broadly we're heading in the right direction, but we need to message again the opening up also in a sensible way. So, for example, I saw an announcement that said that in the next phase of opening up from early August, gyms and yoga studios are going to be allowed to operate. Now, I sympathize with the desire to do this, but I would really like to see these kinds of moves to open up being accompanied by scientific opinion and medical opinion that says whether or not it's the right thing to do. I haven't seen that, right? It's done by a bureaucrat who decides. Let me give you a small example. Pune went through a lockdown, probably very necessary as the cases were rising to the largest number per day in the country about 2 weeks ago. And we had a lockdown for about 10 days. There were two measures in two municipal corporations, in the Pune Municipal Corporation and the Pimpri-Chinchwad Municipal Corporation. In one of those municipal corporations, if you were over 60, you weren't allowed to go out. In the other, if you were over 65, you weren't allowed to go out. Why the difference? Obviously, no one noticed that they were specifying something that was different. My point is not to point out something that was obviously silly, right? It's instead that any such moves that we make, any such directives that we come up with have to be based on science, have to be based on expertise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you make a very good point when you raise the question, is the opening of gyms and yoga that is permitted after August the 1st based on science? And if it is,
Yes.
have the science beside us and in front of us, or is it simply
Yes.
a decision taken by a bureaucrat, in which case we need to ask why is it being taken? Against this background of the situation as the economy faces today, let me ask you, what do you believe will be the impact, both of the virus and the lockdown, on economic growth over the course of this financial year as a whole? The State Bank of India has suggested that, in fact, the economy could decline by as much as 6.8%. The ratings agency ICRA says it could decline by 9.5%. And the former chief statistician Pranab Sen, who's very highly regarded, has said that, in fact, the diminishment or decline in the economy could be as much as 12.5%. Now, you're a major industrialist. You have an acute sense of what is happening. You're also a former president of CII. What's your sense of the size of the impact on growth, both of the virus and the lockdown?
So my estimate for what happened in Q1 was minus 30%, right? And the minus 30% is on the basis of what GST revenue showed. And I factored out the impact of agriculture, which didn't change at all, as we were saying earlier on, and government, and its government, the government component in GDP, which wouldn't have changed at all. So if you factor that out, then I think the 40% decline that we saw in GST revenues in Q1 should actually reflect a 30% fall in GDP in Q1. Yeah? Why is that important? If we fell 30% in Q1, right, think of what we have to do. We have to grow at, essentially, we would have to grow at 10%, I think, a year for the next 3 quarters, right, to nullify that minus 30% effect of Q1. No one is projecting that. Q2 is also going to show a minus. And if Q3
do you have
and
any
Q4,
sense of what the minus in Q2 will be?
so my sense is about minus 10%. Yeah. So, I mean, we'll see how it actually goes. It obviously depends also on the spread of infection and whether or not there are more of these smaller lockdowns. And we'll talk about how some of those should be done in a minute and how some shouldn't be done. But I think my guess is minus 10% in Q2. And then looking forward, I think the best we can look at for this year, the very best, my best case scenario is minus 5% GDP. I think it's likelier that we'll be closer to minus 10%. Yeah, for the year as a whole.
So in other
And the
words,
reason,
a year as a whole, you believe we will be somewhere between -5 and -10. Best case
that's right.
-5, but it's possible it could be -10.
Yes. And we should be clear how dramatic a swing this is, because remember that in the budget, as recently as the 1st of February, we were projecting that we would grow +7% this year. So, it's a huge swing from
Absolutely.
+7 or even last year's +4 to be at -5 or -10. It's actually not just -5, -10, it's -5, -10 plus whatever plus we were going to work, we were expecting to achieve this year.
Now, from the layman's point of view, the big question in everyone's mind is what will be the impact on employment and jobs? Because that's where lack of growth begins to hit people worst of all. Now, CII has said that the unemployment rate for the full month at the end of June, which is the last full month available, is 10.99%. That's the unemployment rate at the end of June. I noticed yesterday, the 29th, that the Economic Times reported that MSME officials had told the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Commerce that as many as 100 million jobs were in danger right across the country. That's a frighteningly large number. Is that your sense also of the potential signs of unemployment looming ahead?
So, if you look at employment data, and I think the CMIE data does us a wonderful service by giving us periodic real-time, almost real-time employment data. It's far better than any of the official data that we get on employment. When in mid-April, they showed that the unemployment rate was minus, if I remember now, at its very worst, it was -27%, right? And it went from 7% to 27% unemployment between mid-March and mid-April. Mid-May, it was down to about 21%. Mid-June, it was down to 11%, right? In July, they've reported that it's now at 8-9%.
Except that's a weekly figure. I'm just adding for the audience, the July figures are weekly. The June figure of 10.99 was an average for the whole month.
Yes, absolutely. This is a weekly estimate where it asks people actually on a particular day, they ask them if they were employed the previous day. So it's a snapshot in time for a particular day.
Absolutely. Please carry on.
Yeah. So if you look at that recovery, that actually ties in with the finance secretary's point about a V-shaped recovery, because you saw this huge drop in employment from one month to the next, and then you've seen this huge recovery. This huge recovery is driven entirely by necessity. It's driven entirely by actually the very informal labor market that characterizes most of employment in our country. And given that most of our employment is so informal and so day to day, it means that people have to be employed or they will not be able to live.
Absolutely.
And that's what we've seen happen in these last 4 months.
So then how do you respond to the report in the Economic Times yesterday?
Yeah.
But
so this MSME thing. Yeah.
told the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Commerce that as many as 100 million jobs could be at risk.
So I don't know about where the 100 million jobs figure comes from. That's pretty well most of MSME employment. So I don't know where that number comes from. But are we going to see a substantial impact on employment? Yes, I fear so. From just talking to different people who run shops, people who open restaurants, anything to do with the hospitality industry, I think they're really stressed and worried. And the smaller enterprises, and the great bulk of employment in hospitality is small enterprises. It's people running salons and spas. It's people running small restaurants. It's people, providing tourism and travel services.
And this means
they're at risk.
That the most vulnerable will be also amongst the most unemployed. Their jobs are tenuous, They are most vulnerable. They are the easiest to lose. They are the ones who will suffer. Let me raise
Yes.
to a second danger, this time flashed or targeted by the RBI's financial stability report. They just reported last week that non-performing assets could increase to 14.7%. And I noticed that two leading private sector bankers, Deepak Parekh and Uday Kotak, have now formally
Yes.
said to the government, do not increase the moratorium. And separately, I noticed that the chairman of the State Bank of India, Rajneesh Kumar, has told the Financial Times that the stress in sectors like aviation, hospitality, and hotels could have a very damaging impact on the books of public sector banks. How worried are you about the financial sector?
So I think we will see from the government a package to address the particularly stressed sectors. I wish we'd seen it already. I worry that while the government has been responsive to economic distress, they've been responsive with far too much of a delay. They need to be much more fast paced in putting together their programs of recovery, because if they do not act faster, they will simply act too late to save good enterprises and to save jobs.
Well, can I interrupt there? Because we're talking about the need for the government to deliver greater stimulus. At the moment,
Not necessarily.
sorry?
Not necessarily.
But let
See,
me
there
finish
are
the
two.
question and then you answer it.
Yeah,
Let me finish the
yeah.
question. So far, the government claims that the total stimulus it's delivered is worth 20.9 lakh crore, but every single analyst in the business has pointed out that the fiscal element is barely 1 or 1.2% of GDP.
Yeah.
So the pointed question I want to ask you is, do we need a greater fiscal stimulus? And if the answer is yes, how much and how soon?
So the answer is yes, and the answer is now. But it can't be everything that we can possibly afford to do, because it's likely that we will need some additional stimulus a month or two from now again. So we can't use all our capability and resources and ammunition today. How much do we need? What we use it for is going to be more important than the total amount that we provide. But the estimate that we would make from CII and work that we've done in the Economic Affairs Council of CII is that we probably need an additional 2% to 3% of stimulus now. And this stimulus should take the form of direct spending by the government. It should take a few different forms. It should take the form of direct spending by the government in terms of direct benefit transfers to the most vulnerable. It should take the form, some of which has been done, but there's still some groups left out. It should take the form of paying its bills, where the government actually pays companies, small and large, what they're actually owed, and including their own public sector units such that they can then pay others. Right? And it should take the form of direct support for those enterprises in particular stressed sectors. So the point that you mentioned that Deepak Parekh and Uday Kotak raised with the RBI governor, the point that you mentioned about stress sectors such as hospitality, this is what will need actual support from the government. It can come in the form of loan guarantees, but it will probably need to come in the form of some direct grants as well that will save these enterprises.
The problem is that you began by saying we need it now. But on
Yes.
the 24th of this month, speaking to FICCI, the chief economic advisor has said that a fiscal stimulus package will be announced, but he added pointedly, when the vaccine is discovered. I'm going to quote his exact words to you. The right point will be when vaccines come and thereby uncertainty goes down. I think that time will be very right for the fiscal push. Now, you know, and I know, we may not have a vaccine for a year. We may not have it for a year and a half. We simply don't know when we'd have it, although we hope it will be soon.
So,
Can we afford to wait for that length of time for this fiscal?
so if you ask the question, when we have that uncertainty go away and we have a vaccine, will we need a fiscal stimulus at that point? Quite possibly, to bring about that full-fledged recovery that we need at that point in time. But does that mean we don't need it now? No, we need it now, right? And we need it now in the absence of we need it now precisely to reduce economic uncertainty while we still cope with health uncertainty. So I don't agree with the I don't agree with the perspective that the health uncertainty has to go away before we can start addressing the economic uncertainty. I think we need to address the economic uncertainty today.
That's very clear. Let me put to you what many people believe is the reason why the government is shying away from a fiscal stimulus at this point and postponing it to later and later. And that's because the government is concerned about the impact on the fiscal deficit. In an article that she wrote for the Indian Express, the principal economist of ICRA has calculated that if you take into account the expected shortfall in tax and non-tax revenue, if you take into account the full cost of the free food grain scheme and the fact that the center will probably have to compensate the states for GST shortfalls, she says that the fiscal deficit could surge to 16 trillion rupees. Now she accepts that this will be offset by increase in revenue because the tax on petrol and diesel have gone up, and also because there are government savings in expenditure because dearest allowance has gone down. But we're still, she says, talking of a fiscal deficit around 6%. If now you add to that the stimulus you want, both now and when there's a vaccine, how much higher do you think the government can allow the fiscal deficit to go?
So the numbers that I'm seeing actually for estimates of the total deficit this year are more on the order of 12%, reflecting, so not 6 but 12%, reflecting the state deficits as well, reflecting also the off-balance sheet items that we do not officially count in our deficit but should.
I have left out both the off-balance and the state. You're absolutely right.
So if you add those in, we're talking about probably around 12%, including, of course, the revenue shortfall that one is facing right now.
But then, Mr. Govt, you're making my question yet more poignant. If already you're looking at a 12% overall nationwide deficit, what they call the public sector borrowing requirement, then how much higher are you willing to see the deficit go so that we have the stimulus you want?
So why do countries worldwide, when they are already running this year, as you know, budget deficits of 10% and more of GDP, why are they increasing that deficit? For the same reason that we need to in India as well. The deficit, as you know, is the gap between revenue and expenditure. We should put it the other way around since it's a deficit. It's the gap between expenditure and revenue, right? And if you look at that gap, right, the concern is on the revenue side, right? If we do not increase expenditure in particular areas, the revenue collapse could be even greater, right? So if, for example, you see mass unemployment, this will show directly in two areas. It will be a reflection of stress in companies. So corporate taxes will drop dramatically. They've already dropped significantly in Q1. Second, personal income taxes will drop dramatically too. And then the spending power of people and therefore GST revenues will drop dramatically too.
Absolutely.
So you'll see all of those drops in revenue expenditure, which can be addressed by actual fiscal stimulus.
In a nutshell, what you're saying, that the reason we need a fiscal stimulus now, and therefore why the government shouldn't worry about what size of fiscal deficit it ends up with, is that without that stimulus, economic activity will slow down, revenues will collapse, livelihoods will be lost, and in fact, the problem facing the economy will be worse. Whereas if you do have a stimulus, it will kick up the deficit, but economic activity will revive and reduce that deficit itself. And therefore, you'll have a virtuous circle, whereas without that stimulus, you're literally spiraling down a hole.
Exactly. So the idea is increase your expenditure so you can increase your revenue,
In
right?
which,
And so by doing that, you address the deficit directly.
in which
Yeah.
case, let me end this part with a very different question, but perhaps in some ways a very telling question. It's quite clear from your answer and from a lot of other economists who've been writing in newspapers or giving interviews on television that there is a very broad measure of consensus about what is required and what the government should do. And in a sense, the chief economic advisor accepts there is need for stimulus. The problem is the government is waiting for what it considers the right time. And my question is this: is time on the government side?
So I don't think the government is waiting for the right time. I mean, if you say that, I don't know, I have no basis for thinking that the government has what it wants to do completely ready and it's waiting for the right time to roll it out. I do not think that's where it is, right? I think it's still figuring out what it should do and where it should do it, and ensuring that there is adequate support in the government to do it. So, you know, I don't have any sense that it's purely a choice of timing issue. But I will repeat the point that I think timing is essential and sooner is essential.
But
If
then,
the, if,
Bob,
yeah, if,
what you've said is actually more distressing, if not actually disturbing. You said, and I'm quoting you, the government is still figuring out what to do, where to do it, and whether there's adequate support in the government to do it. In other words, even after 4 months, the government doesn't know what to do. It's at a loss. That's terrible.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I wouldn't say that the government doesn't know what to do, but I would repeat that my sense is, and it's only my sense, that the government is still trying to figure out what to do.
But hang on a second, you just contradicted yourself. You began by saying, I won't say the government is not sure what to do, but you ended up saying the government is still figuring out what to do. If you're figuring out what to do, it means
they're weighing. Yeah, they're weighing different. I think they're still weighing different options. I wish they would move faster.
Okay, that's absolutely clear. I don't think it's right to push you further. You've made your point crystal clear. Let's take a quick break at that point, and in the limited time available, I want to ask you a very different question. There is a view that an economic crisis is a moment to push through reforms that are needed, which otherwise the political system will not accept. Is this one such moment, and are there such reforms that the government should seriously push through? All of that,
I think absolutely.
In a moment's time after this break. Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is co-chairman of Forbes Marshall and a former president of CII, Naushad Forbes. Mr. Forbes, there is a view that an economic crisis is a moment when a government can push through vitally needed economic reforms, which are otherwise in normal times politically difficult to handle. A, do you agree with that view? And if you do, are there reforms in your mind that this is a moment the government should push through?
So I think it's a great opportunity for reform. It's a great opportunity for reform because everyone in the country, whether it's social groups, whether it's people at large, or whether it's people in policy circles, are clear that action is needed and justified. Second, reforms are cheap. You can put through many reforms that will actually, in some ways, add to revenue, and in some areas will provide great optimism for the future, and which will not cost anything, at least in the short run.
So what reforms do you have in mind?
So I'll give you a few examples. One is a reform that has been announced, which we talked about earlier, around agricultural markets. Those reforms do not cost the government anything, and they are potentially very powerful in unleashing productivity growth within the agricultural sector, because it can allow, for example, the consolidation of farms through contract farming. It can allow, for example, much larger scale cultivation of things like oilseeds. It can allow, for example, the move to more value-added crops in fruits and vegetables, where India is already the largest producer and we could be the world's largest exporter by far. So there's lots of opportunity there, and I think the reforms that have been brought in, we should be focusing on how to implement them really effectively. It's a very good move.
Can I ask you on those reforms? On
Yeah.
those particular reforms, can I ask, do you support the move to facilitate contract farming and
Yes.
also to change agricultural marketing?
Yes, both are very sensible.
Okay.
Both are very sensible. Contract farming, because it allows consolidation and more productive farming methods, and agricultural and also the cultivation of crops, like for example oilseeds, where you will bear the harvest 7 years down, which a small farmer cannot afford to do, but a large farmer coming in and consolidating a plantation can afford to do.
Okay.
So if you take for example the second point on markets, it makes total sense to, instead of having a particular group that has a monopoly over, for example, the pricing of onions, you break that up and you have many groups and you let people sell their markets to whoever, their onions to whoever is the largest payer for onions. So I think it's a very sensible move.
That's very clear. I stopped you because you were about to go on to other reforms. Why don't you tell us about the other reforms you have in mind?
So the second big opportunity is obviously in privatization. If you take, and I think, we should stop calling it disinvestment. I mean, disinvestment is such a mealy-mouthed term. It sort of means we want to disinvest a little. We should go for full-fledged privatization of public sector enterprises, and a good place to start would actually be the banks. An area which the government refuses to entertain, and not just this government, the previous government as well, refuses to entertain, is the privatization of public sector banks. This is a good time to do it.
Can I stop you there? Because in her comments in May, when she was laying out Atmanirbhar Bharat, the finance minister did indicate that there would be extensive privatization as a result of restricting public sector to just strategic sectors and ensuring that there were no more than 4 public sector units in each of those strategic sectors. However, subsequently, not the finance minister, but officials of the finance ministry made it clear, banks will not be privatized. So you're getting privatization, or at least you're getting a promise of privatization. Whether it's delivered or not, we don't know. And the government's track record on delivery is pretty poor. But the one area you want, which is banks, seems to have been ruled out.
It's not the one area. I mean, I want banks to be included in the privatization program. I think there should actually be a huge move to privatize across sectors. Now, you might make the argument that prices aren't good at this time. I'm not so sure that's true. If you look at what's happened with the stock market, which I do not understand at all and have never made any claim to understand, it plummeted in March, but it's recovered very substantially since then. So prices for many companies, private companies, have recovered very substantially. Many companies in certain sectors are today quoting at their all-time highs. So it is possible to get good values for public sector enterprises as well. The way I would do it for banks is to drop to a 49% shareholding first. Having dropped to a 49% shareholding in the bank, right, I think you'll see a huge appreciation in the value of each of those banks, because you're sending a clear signal that you're going to a minority stake. And the moment you see that huge appreciation, then the government can sell a few shares at a time over the next few years to bring its stake down in public sector banks and really address the deficit, get resources available for everything else that it wants to do.
Is there a third reform you have in mind?
So privatization would be the big second reform. Third, I think there's a real need for reform on the trade policy side. Over the last 3 years, we've seen an increasing degree of protection being brought in for the country. We've seen tariffs increased in hundreds of different items. Some of that is perhaps justified as a result of dumping from China and so on. Much of it is not. Much of it is sheer protection. And I think we need to see a change in direction where we integrate much more with the world economy, even when the world is not. Because I think this is a time that we really have an opportunity to make India matter in world trade circles.
I'll just interrupt and point this out that your call for greater reform in trade policy, moving away from protectionism, moving away from increasing tariffs, probably most people would say runs counter to the thinking of this government. They have done quite a lot in the last 6 years to increase protectionism, increase tariffs, and deliberately decide not to join RCEP. But let me put another reform to you myself, and then we'll have to end the interview. Do you believe there is a need for labor reform, and is this the right moment to do it?
So, yes, I mean, if I can add one sentence on trade policy reform and then come to labor reform. One more sentence on trade policy reform is this government has actually said both things. It said that it's acted by protecting industry more, but it constantly talks about wanting to engage more and more with the world, be much more outward looking. And the Prime Minister has personally, I think, put in a great deal of effort to try to attract the world's leading companies to invest in India. So I think we see both coming from the government. We see this enthusiasm for global engagement, and we see this protection at the same time. And we need to make it one direction. We're engaged with the world. We want to trade more. We're going to reduce tariffs. We're going to engage more. We're going to sign FTAs with the US and the EU.
To make your point, we're running out of time. Come to labor reform before we end. Do you believe on labor, and is this the right time?
So on labor reform, I believe we have a big task. It's not simply a matter of making more flexible the existing labor regulations. That is essential, but that's not the only thing we need to do. We need to recognize that over 85% of total employment in our country is informal employment. And it's informal employment where people have next to no protection and employers have almost complete flexibility. Less than 15% of employment is formal sector employment, where employers have almost no flexibility and employees have almost complete protection. We need a balance between these two. We need a new social contract where we have a balance of flexibility and protection across the labor force. It's not a short fix. It's not something that can even be done in a year. But if we don't start fixing that today when we're in a crisis, when will we ever engage with this huge issue?
You said it's not a short fix. Let me remind you that at least 3 BJP state governments, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, have actually said that they will carry out fairly sweeping labor reforms, oddly enough, only for 3 years by ordinance. Now, we don't know whether the central government will permit those reforms, but do you think this vision of doing it A, by ordinance, and B, only for 3 years is the correct approach?
No, I don't think it should be only for 3 years. It should be permanent, right? But it should not only be making formal labor much more flexible. It should also be about taking the 85% of the workforce that is informally employed and providing greater protection. We need to do both together. And if we do both together, I think it will be both socially acceptable and it will be the right long-term solution for us as a country.
Mr. Forbes, thank you for a comprehensive interview. I'm very grateful that you've made time available to us and that you've explained your position and your thinking so fully. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan. You stay safe too. Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.